This interview with Sara Goldberg is under the auspices of the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, Boulder Public Library, and the Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry, BASJ, project through the Jewish Studies Department of the University of Colorado. Sara was volunteer coordinator of the BASJ. We are in Boulder, Colorado. It is December the 15th, 2010. Liz McCutcheon is filming, and I'm Shirley Seal. Sara, to start, where and when were you born, and where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in 1960 in La Jolla, California. My father was doing a postgraduate program in San Diego, and then we moved to Syracuse, New York, which is where I spent my childhood, and moved to Colorado in '74, finished high school here and went to college here and stayed. So I've been here pretty much ever since.
What was your family like? What were also what kind of neighborhoods did you live in?
Well, family growing up, I grew up in a family, both parents were Jewish, but we really didn't practice. My mother's family immigrated from Russia, so she was first generation American, and my father actually immigrated from Argentina, so he came over in his late teens, early 20s for college, for the university, to go to the university. And we were a very political family. There was a lot of dinner time conversations about current events and politics, and one of my fondest memories is remember going door to door with my mother during the McGovern campaign for president, and also for some local campaigns as well. My father was a professor at the university in Syracuse, and my mom worked in his lab. She was a zoologist, and he was a microbiologist. So very academic home, and the neighborhood that we grew up in was pretty modest neighborhood in Syracuse, somewhat integrated, very close to an area that was predominantly low-income housing projects, East Coast housing projects. So the schools that I attended as a child were very integrated schools, inner city schools. And it was the 60s, so it was fun times. Moving to Colorado in the 70s to Denver, going to a high school that was predominantly affluent and Anglo suburban school was a big adjustment for me. But
why?
Well, number one, going from a school that was 70% African American to a school that maybe had 7 African Americans in it, or at least that was my perception. I went to Cherry Creek High School, was a shock. And I remember storming into the principal's office asking demanding that they take a look at busing and integrating their school. So let's just say that didn't go over so well, and I was watched for the rest of my tenure at high school for the most part. But you know, I grew up in a family where the conversations were always about, you don't run away from problems, you sit, you think about them, and you come up with ways to change them for the good. And so that's what, as a teenager, that was what I perceived to be the right direction to go for the school, but they didn't think so.
I'm interested just to take it back a step. Your grandmother, who came from Russia,
right?
Where in Russia did she come from, and when? If you know.
Well, I don't know the exact date. I know that they came over in the very early 1900s. I want to say like between 1900 and 1910, from Finsk is what I recall them saying, not Minsk, Finsk. Now, this is all handed down from generations. It could very well have been Minsk, but all we have is an oral account of our family's history, which my cousin, who in my life was my grandmother, but biologically she was my grandmother's first cousin. So when her family immigrated, they stayed with my grandmother's family in New York City. They immigrated. It was the Ellis Island story, came from Russia, all lived together in what was then Jewish Harlem in one apartment. And then as more family members came over, they would get their own apartment. And eventually the family ended up in the Bronx at an apartment on Marshall and Jerome Avenue, where they actually stayed for 52 years. So that was our neighborhood, which is very different today than what it was when I was growing up. But I have fond memories of that neighborhood. Great deli food, great pickles.
It sounds like you kept the tradition going.
I've tried, and even more so. Like I said, my family, my grandfather immigrated from Russia, and he was a pretty staunch communist. So, back then you were identified as Jew as an ethnic group rather than a religious group. And so religion was really nothing that was practiced in our home or in his home. And I remember conversations with my cousin grandmother, who was identified herself as a strong Zionist socialist. And the two of them, I guess, very heated Friday night dinners.
I should think so.
Growing up in New York, or going as they moved to New York.
I guess I can ask more about activism, but you had a good toehold right there.
Yeah, I mean, activism is kind of who we are, and I guess I've always taken it to the next level. I mean, as I became a young adult, I lost my mother when I was 13. And so I think that part of what kept me going through those difficult times was my passion and my commitment to social change. And some of the things that I got involved in, I was very active with the organization here in Boulder that worked to close Rocky Flats. And I remember being involved with the group that circled Rocky Flats. And I remember one year there was a big protest out there where Bonnie Raitt and Jackson Brown came, and we were peacekeeping at the stage, and was very active in that movement, as well as many others. I spent a year in Binghamton, New York, and helped get the bottle bill passed in New York State back in, when was that? That was probably 1981, I think. 81 or 82, I think that was. So, things like that, and all of the work that I've ever done professionally has really been in community service and trying to make a difference. So.
And professionally, what were you? Are you?
I'm still trying to figure that out. Professionally, so my background is in community organizing and sociology, and how I've applied that is working for a lot of nonprofits and community groups. So I've worked for agencies in Boulder, Community Food Share. I helped get their gleaning project started. That was my first job out of college, so I want to say that was like 1981 back there. I worked for Community Action, Boulder County Community Action Program, working on hunger relief and food sustainability programs. I've worked for, we lived in San Diego, and I ran a neighborhood program for the homeless in Ocean Beach. I did that for a number of years, came back to Colorado, worked for an agency, Neighborhood Reinvestment, which was an organization funded by the federal government to revitalize areas and cities in low-income areas. And so we did a lot of work with organizing community. It was a very grassroots model that we employed, and did a lot of both working with neighborhoods as well as local businesses to revitalize their business areas. And worked with the City of Boulder Youth and Family Services Department, running their child care resource and referral service. And then started doing some work in the Jewish community with Boulder Action for Soviet Jewry, and from there did some work with Allied Jewish Federation Women's Department in Boulder, worked in the public schools, Now I'm running Hebrew High, which is a program for Jewish teens. So I've bounced around. You know, I kind of say the population has changed, but the work really is the same.
Mm-hmm. One way or another.
Yeah.
How did you get recruited for Boulder Action of Soviet Jewry?
You know, I want to say that it was, the application was in the community, and then there were some people that pointed me towards that application or the job description, and it was just a really good fit for me, both in terms of I love learning about Russian history just because of my family, and it was a perfect fit because I had done so much work working with volunteers, and they were looking for a volunteer coordinator. So
let me stop you for a moment. You said the application was in the community,
right.
and I'm not sure what you meant with.
What I mean is it was posted. They had a job that was open.
Oh, all right.
There was a job description and posting out in the community, and someone brought my attention to it, and I submitted an application. And I knew some of the people on the board. Yeah, so
they'd be glad to see you coming.
I think so. They hired me.
So, hard question.
Sure.
When? What year was that?
What year was that? I want to say.
Let me divide it down a little
Sure.
bit. Had they been already operating? Was it just at their beginning?
It was actually towards the end.
Okay.
So I want to say my daughter, it was probably 16 years ago. I remember she was about 1 or 2 years old, and she's now 18. So I would have to go backwards in years. So that would be, she was probably 94. Is that right?
Sounds late.
It was late. It was like the last 2 years of.
Okay,
I think I was there for the final 2 years.
All right.
Yeah.
And who had preceded you?
I don't think anybody in that particular job.
Okay.
Carol Watkins was the director
Yes.
for the program, staff person, and I think she did all of the pieces.
I see.
And it got to the point where they needed some additional help, and so they broke this position out and hired just someone to do the volunteer piece.
Okay.
Because she really needed to focus. At that point, there were more and more families that had resettled, and so her time was being taken up working with the new families in Boulder and helping to make sure that services were being provided and their needs were being met now that they were in this country. So she had less time to do the volunteer piece as well.
It was it a volunteer job, or were you paid?
It was a paid job.
And I'm not asking how much you were paid, but I'm wondering,
remember.
Do you have any idea where they obtained the funds? Was BASJ under a grant?
Yeah, they had some grant funding. Yeah, but honestly, I just can't recollect exactly who the funders were.
Do you know, because you have a lot of roots in the community, do you know if there were other Jewish community agencies that were involved in it?
The synagogues,
even in Denver.
Yeah, the synagogues got involved. I know Jewish Family Services was very involved in Denver, and then the local branch here in Boulder as well. But there was also, and the name's going to escape me. There was a organization that was a Christian organization that was very involved in helping with resettlement.
That was Boulder?
In Denver.
Okay.
In Denver, but they worked with Boulder families. So they would help families with the logistics around some of the paperwork that needed to be done, getting assistance, when they first arrived until they were ready to go out and find employment. So, but I can't remember the name of that organization because Carol was the one that worked more closely with them than I did. I really worked, my focus was on the Boulder community and getting volunteers trained and assigned to work with new families that came to this country.
And I want to get into that too. But the HIAS in Denver, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, was that? Do you remember that?
It doesn't ring a bell to me.
And did any of the Denver organizations help as far as you were concerned, or Carol Watkins was concerned in terms of what do we do next?
Oh, I think very much so with Carol, not so much with me. But Carol worked very closely with those organizations as well as the board. The BASJ board worked with these agencies. There was a lot of legal paperwork that needed to be taken care of and processed, as well as once families or individuals came to this country, there were a lot of legal papers at that point as well that needed to be followed up on, because people were eligible for assistance, and it wasn't, and I'm not going to remember the name of the assistance program, but it was there were funds available to help pay for apartment and utilities, as well as some living expenses for a period of time. And I don't remember again if it was, it wasn't a long period of time. The number that comes to mind is like a 4-month period. But again, this is a long time ago, and I could be wrong. But it was a short period to help with the transition while people were getting adjusted and getting all of their legal papers in order to be able to go out and locate work. So she worked with those agencies, and they were from Denver.
Okay. So those would be nonprofit agency, not state or federal.
That's correct.
Okay.
But I do believe some of the funding may have been government money. It wasn't all, but it was funneled through these organizations, and they allocated it.
Well, I know that wasn't the major part of your job, but
not my job. Yeah, and you're taking me back many years, so.
Well, that's all right.
That's okay.
And now you're the volunteer coordinator. And who told you what you were supposed to do? Did they have a job description?
They did have a written job description, and my direct supervisor was Carol Watkins, and so I worked directly with Carol. I didn't have an office, so I worked at home primarily, and then a lot of the community work obviously was done on site. We would have volunteer trainings and programs at different sites in the community. But the job really was to identify, one, what the volunteer jobs were that were needed to work with the new families that came to the States, provide adequate training, make sure that people that were coming or that were volunteering to work with the families were willing to do so for a period of time. Because the last thing we wanted, and some of the issues with volunteers, people sign up and then they don't follow through. But when you're working with human beings and people in transition and people that are going through what can be a very challenging period, that relationship and the one-on-one that they're establishing is so critical that it was absolutely important to make sure we got the right volunteers for the right positions. And so that's what I did. So it was a lot of outreach and marketing in the community through the local congregations and the Jewish community in general. I did a lot of speaking in front of boards, in front of meetings that were held, congregational meetings. We developed, back then it was before the new marketing with all the social networking, so the more traditional newspaper advertising and public service announcements, and of course word of mouth as well to recruit volunteers. And I want to say that at the height we had about 125 volunteers to 150 at one time, and these would be people that did a lot of different things. We had volunteers that would be that would greet families that arrived at the airport. We had volunteers that would locate and transport supplies, furniture, kitchen utensils, towels, sheets, all of the things you don't think about, but these people are coming with nothing, and so you're having to furnish apartments. So we had volunteers that would actually not only find these items and work with Carol, because Carol really would help to procure these items, but we needed volunteers to move furniture. So a lot of the furniture was stored at a barn or an outbuilding on Roxanne Balin's property, and volunteers would be identified to go out, get the furniture, move it to the apartment, help get the apartment set up before the families arrived. So that was one piece. We had volunteers that would become, and I don't remember the term we used, but basically friends of the family to help them with their transition.
So is that the host families?
The host families.
Okay.
So they would work with, they would be matched with a family, and they would help them negotiate things like take them for their first visit and many other visits to the grocery store. Imagine coming to this country from another country where they might have 2 soaps available, and you have a whole aisle of soap. So just to help people understand how to shop with mail, when you don't think about it again, but you get your mail and you see some kind of junk mail, it says important, don't throw away, open immediately. And so to try to help these new families understand what is important, what is junk, how to navigate the mail system. So host volunteers would do a variety of things, help them set up bank accounts, understand how to balance a bank account and checking accounts. So, kind of talk about the whole financial aspect. Now, our volunteers helped on a regular basis. They'd come and meet or drive people to appointments. If a host family couldn't do it, we had other volunteers that would come and help drive, or help take people shopping, help register for school. And these were things that Carol did a lot of, but she got a lot of support from the volunteers. Because as I said, as BASJ was around for a while, more and more families relocated to the area, requiring more and more attention from the community, and Carol was one person. So we had our host families. We we did events. We had events for the new immigrants to help them meet other people in the community, just from more of a social perspective, where we would bring volunteers in and community members and kind of mingle. And a lot of times that was done at the synagogues. What else did we? I mean, it was just, there were a lot of little pieces as well.
When I hear you talking about the things that the volunteers did, my mind says, how could you write an advertisement for a volunteer that would include all those things?
Right. Well, I think that
how did you describe it?
Yeah, I think the description was somewhat generic, that we were looking for volunteers to work with new families in Boulder. And it depends on where you're advertising. So if we were advertising through Volunteer Connection in the newspaper, you get a small little paragraph, if that. And so you basically say that, to work directly with families to help transport furniture, to take people to appointments. So there, I think we were very, very general. And then when people would apply to be a volunteer, that's when I would meet with them and talk with them and find out more about specifically what their time and talents were and interests, and then figure out what the best position was to plug them into. So, when you market, you keep it general, and then there's the one-on-one, kind of the interview, to learn who these people are and what they want to do and what the best fit is. And also, who's a better fit for an elderly couple coming, who's a better fit for a family with young children, a better fit for a family with teens, because we had a variety of people that came. And, it's very funny because there's people I still work with today in different capacities that were volunteers way back when, who are still in touch with their families and still stay in touch. And it warms my heart to see that those relationships for many of these families have maintained for 15 years, long time.
More than probably.
Yeah.
What happened when you would have a feeling maybe this isn't the volunteer who's going to be able to stay with us, who's going to fit in?
Right.
How would you handle that?
Well, then I would just, like I said, we had a variety of different needs. So we would find something that person might be interested in doing on a short-term basis. And it could be things like running errands, or occasionally being available to drive someone to an appointment, or helping with move-in, or I'm trying to think of those were the big pieces that we did. Oh, and then of course the ESL, helping families learn the language. So we had other home visitors that would just work with our families or our new Americans with language learning English. And so they would come in and just go basically be English language coaches, I guess is what you would call them. So we had a whole group of volunteers that worked with our families, and we would have different ones for each family member, so that all the family members were getting support.
Oh, so it would just not be one per family?
No, because you'd want a different teacher for grandma than you would want for
Yes.
the 14-year-old child. And so those relationships also were developed. But you would never place someone in that position either that you knew couldn't follow through on a regular basis. And we worked quite closely too with the program at CU that works with second language learners. And I'm not going to I can see her face, and I'm not going to remember the name of the organization. Yeah, it's not coming to me.
Well,
But they did a lot of the actual educating, the
Yes.
English education. We just supported the education in the home.
what was your position like in terms of supervising volunteers, or were you mostly an encourager or
No, we
definer?
did everything. I mean, we located the volunteers, then all volunteers had to go through a very lengthy training session.
Okay, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, the training sessions we had were day-long events, and they involved, we had board members come talk about a little bit of background of who the people are that are coming, some of the cultural considerations to be aware of, differences in culture. Carol would come and talk about the logistics of what it's like to acclimate and assimilate to a new culture. So she would talk about things, kind of the process. It's almost like, when you lose someone in grief, there's a process that immigrants also go through when they leave their homeland and their families, and even if they didn't have families, their friends, what's familiar, their language, their customs, their clothing, their food, and come somewhere new. So she would talk a lot about kind of things to expect, the emotional changes.
Yes.
That there might be some anger or depression, and what to do in those cases. Because oftentimes our volunteers were the people that had the most direct one-on-one ongoing contact with these individuals. And so if there were things that they were noticing or seeing, they would be the ones to let us know, the staff know, so that we could get more support into the home or to help them through a difficult time. So she would talk about that. Then we would talk about the specifics of the different positions, and we would break the volunteers up by position. So people that were going to be host families, there was a training for host families. People that were going to be working with language, we had language teachers come and work with them specifically. So we did some breakout too, based on the type of position that the people would be having. But they were, when they signed up, they were signing up for, I want to say it was a 1 year, the commitment at the time, and that they would go through this day-long training, and also agreed to have meetings with me and or Carol, depending on their position, check-in meetings. And then the last thing was that we always did an annual recognition for our volunteers. We always thanked them and had a big community event, big being members of the BASJ board, members from the local Jewish community, and the new families would come and to thank the volunteers for the work that they did.
That'd be quite a large number.
It was a fairly large number, yeah. And they were fun. And what the best part was the food, because a lot of the families that came here, the new Americans, would want to bring food. And oh my goodness, some of the food was just magnificent. And it was all about food. Every time you'd go to visit, it was all lots and lots of food. And new flavors. It was fun for us.
So I'm hearing you say that there was no such a thing as an ineffective volunteer. You sort of made them, structured things so that they could be effective.
For 90%, yes. I think when you're dealing with people, you're always going to have some people that start out with great intentions, And I had some volunteers that did that, that started out with great intentions, got started and realized, you know what, even after the training and after agreeing to this, this isn't quite for me. And you know, that was hard. It was hard for the volunteers sometimes, it was hard for the families, it was hard for me. And we worked through it. So, or there would be, you know, you're matching people.
Yes.
Sometimes those matches aren't made as well as you think. And so there would be times when we would have to reassign a volunteer because the personalities didn't work between the families or between the individuals that they were matched up with. And that did happen. It was the exception, thank goodness. But it did happen.
If there was dissatisfaction, would you hear about it through the volunteer or the family?
Both.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to get to find out how the families interacted with you.
Yeah, you know, families would sometimes with me or sometimes more to Carol, because Carol was the one that was in their home more than I was. But there were times when a family would say, you know what, this person, you know, I know that they mean well and I appreciate it, but I'd rather they not come to my home. So then Carol would alert me, and I would I would try to get all the information so I could really talk to the volunteer and just maybe suggest a different approach for them with BASJ, a different route that they might want to take in terms of their time. And the flip side is, if it was a volunteer that wanted to be reassigned or just couldn't volunteer anymore, they would contact me directly because I was kind of their point of contact. So Carol was the point of contact for the New American families. I was the point of contact for the volunteers.
Okay. And you kept in touch with each other.
We met, we would have meetings weekly, and then of course phone. We were on the phone together quite a bit. That was before cell phones, so that was the old-fashioned way. Yeah.
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 How much time did it take out of a day or a week? For you?
I want to say, and I was trying to remember this too. I was looking for the old job description. I could not find it. I was 15 or 20 hours a week.
Oh, all right.
So it wasn't a full-time job. But you know, working for nonprofits, 15 or 20 hours.
I know.
1 week it's 15, 1 week it's 30, 1 week it's 10, then it's 40. So, but on an average, it was a part-time job. It just depended if we had a big volunteer training, or if there was a period of time when we had, I want to say in like 3 or 4 months, almost a family a month coming, which was a lot, and required a lot more time to get everything ready. So, you know, that period I worked more than maybe, but it was a part-time job.
Finding an apartment for a newcomer, whose job would that be?
That was Carol's job, and the board also helped with that.
Yes.
And then once you kind of know the apartment complexes that are clean and affordable.
Eventually,
and
I guess.
And on a bus route.
Oh, yes.
So, you know, there were certain criteria. They weren't the best locations always, the best apartments, but, you know, they were clean and they were accommodating. So,
I wanted to talk a little bit, if it's okay with you, to just move on.
Sure.
To something you started when you were talking about grieving.
Yes.
To cultural adaptations and misadaptations.
Right.
And what were the things that you noticed as far as the New Americans were concerned?
I think that, you know, the cultural adaptation is a very difficult, and was that way for most, not all, but most. You know, you're taking people, so different scenarios. Let's say you have a male family member who comes over and was a professional in their homeland, you know, whether they're an engineer or a doctor or a professional. They come here, and because of, one, their certification doesn't translate to the same certification here. Number two, their language skills don't allow them to compete for the same level of occupation. And number three, that things are done differently, right? So you would have professionals that ended up getting menial jobs, and that was very hard and depressing. And you know, for some, I think some were able to overcome that better than others. So that's one population. I think for some people coming, especially for the elderly, it was language was very difficult to learn the language, and there were some elderly people that really kind of retreated into their home and didn't venture out and didn't really feel connected to the community because, again, language and cultural differences. There were always attempts made to get the families and individuals that came over to Boulder together so that they could create a community amongst themselves. And I know for some of the people that tended to isolate themselves, that was helpful. Because they could speak the language, they felt comfortable, they felt at home. Children, of course, were more adaptable than the adults. But again, even that, getting started in a public school, not knowing a language, clothing. A lot of the kids didn't have the same, just culturally, what they wore in their homeland is very different than what kids wear here. So just making those adjustments. And I think a lot of times they missed their friends, they missed family members that were still in their homeland, they missed the familiar and the things that they had to leave behind, the actual things, the physical possessions. So, you know, and just like in any other scenario in life, certain people adjust better than others. And, you know, I still see people today. In fact, a month ago I'm at Sprouts Market in Boulder and I bump into a woman who I happened to be at the airport the day that her family came. And she's done phenomenally. Children went through college, one's married, but one's working professionally, you know, very well assimilated. Dad, on the other hand, struggled from the beginning and is still struggling, never really kind of found his place here in this country. And a lot of it because of the whole job and professional shifts that he had to make. I think that's hard.
It's understandable, too.
Absolutely. If you're, and I don't know, you know, let's say you're an engineer in one country and you come here and you have to work as a janitor in a nursing home, you know, or you're working in a grocery store. It has an effect on your self-esteem and your identity. And I think that was really hard for many people. But if you look at the second generation, right, the children.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting.
So I think that they've assimilated as well as anybody. And I'll give you an example. So my daughter is now 18. She was a baby when I worked for BASJ, and has a new friend in her life, another gal that comes over quite frequently. And she'd mentioned to me, yeah, her family immigrated from Russia. Oh, and they're Jewish. I said, oh, really? Well, when did they come? And oh, she was 2. Come to find out, she came through BASJ, and this child is graduating from high school and is as American as my daughter in terms of her English skills, her sense of style, her interests. Right now, focusing on finding a university to go to next year. So again, if you look at the children, I think, as is the case with many immigrants throughout history, much easier on the children to assimilate to American life than it was for the parents, for many of the parents.
Excuse me a minute. What do you find that the most effective strategies were for your volunteers to use in the early stages of getting, I'm not sure assimilated is the right word.
Yeah, I'm not
getting
sure either.
Adapted.
Adapted is a good word. You know, I think that initially it was very predictable contact. So for the volunteers to have with the person that they were assigned to or the family they were assigned to, that there needed to be a schedule and a predictable time to meet that both parties agreed upon. So that, number one, because we had these issues, a volunteer would show up and no one's home, or someone's waiting for someone to come and the volunteer doesn't show up. So again, remembering we're talking about relationships between people and honoring each other. It was important for that to be scheduled and consistent. So when we had volunteers that didn't show up on a regular basis, I would have to intervene, or families that happened to go to the grocery store exactly at the time that their volunteer was showing up every week. That needed to be a conversation that usually Carol would have. So, and I think the other thing was that we really stressed with our volunteers was respecting people and their confidentiality and their needs, respecting it one-on-one, definitely when they leave, that they're, that what they hear, see, or encounter is confidential. You don't share it with the community. You don't talk about people. So that expectation of honoring each other, and it went both ways. So there was a training that the families that came to this country would have to go through with Carol, where it was also discussed about the volunteers you're going to have and what to expect, and keeping things confidential, and so that was also a conversation that had to happen in the beginning.
I can see that would be important. It probably wouldn't have occurred to me had I been involved.
Yeah, it was very important to have both very similar conversations on both sides, so that there was a basic agreement. And I'm trying to think the other things. The other things that we try to do is encourage our volunteers to take the families or the individuals out into the community to do normal everyday things. Go for an ice cream cone. Go to the park. Take a hike at Chautauqua. Go out to a normal restaurant. Help them learn how to handle the menu and ordering and paying and tips. Walk down Pearl Street Mall. Take them to a service. So a lot of these families never went to any kind of synagogue or had any kind of involvement in a Jewish religious community. So just, open their eyes to it. If you have a Havurah, invite the families to join you once or twice. And so that was a huge part in the beginning, too, of helping with people adapt to this country and to life here, and also just to help the relationships form. Just hang out, be together, right? So there was a lot of that, especially early on. And then, like I said, there are families that still get together. Holidays, Shabbats. This woman I bumped into at Sprouts, for example, her daughter got married. Guess who was at the wedding? Their host family volunteers. So in the beginning, it was really about helping. It was being human, right? Being human and understanding. So that's.
You must have run into, along the way, you must have run into some other groups in other towns that were doing the same kind of activity.
Oh, yes.
And I'm wondering how this BASJ stacked up against them.
I mean, I think one of the benefits for BASJ was that we were little and we were in a small community.
Okay.
I think for families that immigrated to Denver, that they, although they had support systems, didn't have the same level of contact, maybe, or someone looking out for them as you would in a smaller community, because we had fewer families here, whereas in Denver they had a larger number to help and keep track with. So, I think that was one thing that was nice about Boulder. Flip side, Boulder is limited in terms of for individuals that immigrated to Boulder, the Russian community was small. There were many more families and people in more of a cultural community in Denver. And so over the years, there were a number of families that actually ended up moving to Denver after they got settled and kind of acclimated to life in the States, sometimes after a year. as little as a year. There were some families that left Boulder, others that have stayed all this time.
Do you think they left Boulder because of the potential of finding a Russian community, or because of the jobs?
I think there were a variety of different reasons. For some families, it was definitely the Russian community, especially for seniors.
Yes, I could see
Because
that.
jobs was not as big a deal for them. They were retired.
Yes.
Some people did leave for jobs. Others left because they had family members in other areas. And so they left and didn't even end up in Denver, but maybe went to New York or Chicago or a different community. So for the families that did leave, those were the primary reasons.
Did families leave to go to Israel?
Wow, that's a good question. Nothing is. I don't remember.
Yeah,
I know families had relatives in Israel and
Yes,
visited
I've heard
Israel,
that.
but I don't think any family immigrated or made Aliyah. No.
Okay. It was something I was kind of curious about. How about health issues of your...
Big health issues.
and I'm
standards. And I'm thinking, well, standards are very different.
Okay, that's the place to begin.
Dental health, for example, almost everybody that came needed a fair amount of dental health care. And Carol, bless her heart, she did work miracles to get dental aid and other local dentists to provide dental health care to these people as they came. I remember kids almost there, how many teeth had to be pulled. So dental health was huge, huge. We had other people that came with health issues, that needed to be, receiving treatment once they got here on an ongoing basis. And again, Carol would, we knew this ahead of time, and so she would make arrangements with local physicians and make sure that medical care was being provided. Some people had more imminent medical needs, others were not so much, but everybody would have access to medical care and assessments. And but there were a few people that came needing a fair amount of care, but dental especially. Everybody, it seemed like to us, was big. And then we had babies too.
Yes, I was starting to think about that.
We also had a lot of pediatric, needs for the little itty bitty ones that came. So
you probably had some new babies too.
We did.
Eventually.
We had new babies once they came. Yes. Actually, I remember one family. She was pregnant when she came. So yeah, we had to have that all arranged. But Carol did most of that.
Did you have how did you handle the fact that some volunteers would want to go overboard and do everything?
Right. And that was a big part of the training and a reminder that, really what you are being placed with this family to do is to help them learn how to do for themselves. If you do for them, it's like telling a parent with a child, if you rescue your child and you do for them, they'll never learn to do for themselves. Same thing. And there were many instances where I would have to intervene and talk to a volunteer about backing off, maybe not visiting 5 days a week, because they became friends. That you don't need to take them to the grocery store every time they need to go, because then they would start expecting it and expect you to chauffeur them everywhere. That part of what you need to do is teach them about the bus system. Walk with them if they're in walking distance to the library or to the grocery store or to the doctor's office, because many times the apartments were within walking distance of some of these things. So it was because then the volunteers would get in too deep.
Yes,
so we did often have to intervene and remind people and set some boundaries with them on what was okay to do and what was really not okay to do and why.
Do you think that the the new Americans who came in, what was their expectation of a volunteer? Did you line it up for them, or, well, you couldn't have too easily?
Well, we would, like I said, Carol, once they came, Carol would have meetings with them and help them to understand who are these strangers coming to my house, right?
That's what I'm saying.
Right. So, she, of course, would meet with them first and at length and help them understand what kind of support they would be receiving. And I will say some families were more open to help and some were less.
Yes.
So some wanted less volunteer interaction in their home or involvement in their home, or might some, after a very short period of time, said, you know what, we're fine. We don't need our volunteers anymore. Others cherished it. So again, you're talking about people. Everybody's different. Some people are very private. Other people are very social. So, and then there's everybody in between. But we did have, and then sometimes volunteers felt put upon, because initially you spend more time and you do more, and then you need to slowly back off.
Being put upon
by requests to be driven here, there. I have a doctor's appointment. Can you pick up this prescription for me? Can you go to my daughter's school and help me understand what? So it was being asked to do more than they really were assigned to do.
How would you handle that?
Oftentimes it was, again, a conversation Carol would have with the family, just to, again, reiterate the role of the volunteer and why it was so important for them to do some of these things themselves, that this was part of what they needed to do to become more independent, to really be able to to adapt better in this culture and in our community, and so that it was really in their best interest as well. So,
are there any anecdotes that you would like to talk about that I've forgotten to ask a question about?
No, I mean, for me, I think what is so remarkable is how many years later, bumping into people.
Yes, I should imagine.
The children especially. I mean, I didn't go to the airport for many families, but I did for a few. And for some reason, even of everybody, those are the families I've always felt closest to. And seeing the kids grown up, and they recognize me. And they'll come up to me and say, you were at the airport. I mean, I can't tell you what that means. And or they'll come up to me and they'll ask me about my family rather than the other way around. And it's just hearing what they're doing. I mean, they're in college, they're getting married, they're having their own families, they're professionals, their parents are doing well. It's fantastic. And it's the immigrant story. It's the same story that my family had years ago, right, coming to New York in the early 1900s, basically from the same part of the world. It's just, not quite 100 years later, but almost. And the process was very similar. And, I look at myself even. My father was Argentine, and so I'm really first generation, right, from American, and I look at his life and my life, and you'd never know I was anything but born and bred American, right? And it's the same with these kids. So what BASJ was able to do for these families is absolutely remarkable. And unfortunately, what brought a lot of these families here was somewhat horrific for many of them. So there was also, and we didn't even touch upon this, but there was also a whole issue that we had to address with like post-traumatic stress disorder for some families.
Yeah, well, we sort of touched on it, but
even more severe
right.
For certain families who witnessed atrocities in their home country, in their homeland, which is why they came. Kids that saw family members murdered. So there were a lot of issues that we had to deal with, and support systems we had to have in place. We always knew about these things before families came here, so that we could be working on this ahead of time. And we're very careful what volunteers we placed in those homes, and what kind of support we provided. But just thinking about where people came from, and seeing them today it's fantastic. What BASJ, a small little organization, of community activists that cared and came together and started meeting and formed a board and advocated and was able to get papers filed with the State Department and able to get these families out of where they were and here in a place like Boulder to start over. And they've done it. It's remarkable. It's fantastic.
What has happened in your life since then?
Aside from growing older, what has happened in my life since then? We've all grown up. I have a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old, 2 seniors, one graduating college, one graduating high school. I'm back working in the Jewish community after taking many years off from the Jewish community.
Did your experience there change the way you approached the other things that you've done in the years since then?
I think every job you have affects how you do your next job.
Yes.
It's a growing, and when you work with people and you work with communities especially, when I worked with the homeless, I learned so much, and I take that with me every day. When I worked with Jewish teens today, I learned so much, and I take that with me every day. When I worked with families that were new to this country and understanding where they came from and what they were up against, I take that with me every day. And I also see in them so much of it. It makes what my history that much more alive and real, and probably my passion for reading about that part of the world, the former Soviet Union, and reading a lot about immigrants and families and cultural considerations, I guess you could say. A lot of that, I think, goes back to the work that I did with BASJ. But I'm proud of it. I think it's fantastic. And I wish that there were more organizations doing this. There's so many other parts of the world right now where people could benefit from really being helped to get out of where they are. And I think about Sudan, and I think about the Congo, and I think about parts of the Middle East, and what's going on in Afghanistan and in some of these, Pakistan and other countries. There's so much that we could do in our world to help. So the fact that we did for a period of time with the community is pretty remarkable.
I thank you for putting it into words.
Thank you.
I really did. I think we got a lot of information.
Good. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to remember.
and